So this paper here is about mining subgroups with exceptional transition behavior, and that is a joint work with my colleagues from Cologne, Graz, and Würzburg. So what is this all about? So the main setting here is this is about pattern mining in sequential data. And when we investigate a sequential data set, we often can find interesting regularities that can be captured by some sort of a transition model between the states. For example, in this toy data set here, we have like 4 discrete states, A, B, C, and D, which are corresponding to locations on the map. And what we are finding here is that most people are moving along northern and southern directions, but only seldom move along the east and west axis. However, the population is not homogeneous. So if we have additional information about some persons or the individual transitions, then we can investigate subgroups, such as the subgroup of young tourists. For this subgroup, we find a significantly different behavior as people in this subgroup move in a circle around the city. So maybe they all follow the same recommended tour. If we allow subgroups to be described by conjunctions such as people that are young and that are tourists, then many such subgroups can be formed. However, not all subgroups show such an exceptional transition behavior. For example, if we look at the transitions of all women, or if we would look at the transitions of all transitions that look at night times, then we do not find any significant differences to the transition model of the overall data set. So the goal in this paper is now that we identify from a large set of candidate subgroups those subgroups that exhibit an exceptional transition behavior in comparison to the overall data set. And as you can already see, this is not about predicting something or classifying something. That is really about getting direct insights because we, as humans, can directly understand what young tourist means. So what kind of data do we require for this task? Just to make this clear, so we have a data set of sequences, and we have additional features available that we can propagate on the individual transitions. So for example, we have now personal information on the users who generated the sequence, or we know the time when a transition happened. Basically anything that we can project on the transition level. And we can include this kind of information in a classical tabular data set where each row corresponds to one transition in a sequence. And for each transition, we have different kinds of information available. So to start with, it's the source and the target state of the transition. But we also have a variety of features available that can be used to describe subsets of transitions. Okay, so now we approach our problem by extending a framework which is called exceptional model mining. For those of you who have a background in pattern mining, exceptional model mining is basically a generalization of the classic subgroup discovery task to multiple target attributes. The goal of exceptional model mining is to find descriptions of subsets in the data that imply exceptional parameters. By exceptional, I mean significantly different parameters with respect to a certain model class. One simple example we could find using exceptional model mining with a simple model class like the correlation coefficient model is that in the overall data set there is a strong correlation between our two previously chosen target attributes. But in this specific subgroup that we have found using our approach, there is, in contrast to this, slightly negative correlation coefficient. So how does this in general work? Well, the general approach of exceptional model mining is that we first generate a candidate space of possible subgroups that we want to evaluate. And since we are allowing subgroup descriptions to be conjunctions of different features, there's potentially a really large candidate space there. What we are doing then is we evaluate the subgroups one by one in some kind of a search algorithm, and that goes as follows. So first we determine all instances that correspond to this description. Then we compute the model parameters for these instances of our chosen model class. And then in the third step, we compute some kind of score by comparing the model parameters that have been derived from the subgroup only with the model parameters that are derived from the overall population. Now, if we want to apply this kind of approach to our problem setting of finding subgroups with exceptional transition behavior, then we have like 2 questions to answer. The first one is easy, and that is, what kind of model class do we use? So exceptional model mining has been applied to a variety of model classes like classification models, regression models, Bayesian network models, but not before to sequential data. And this is relatively easy. We just choose something that is well established for this kind of transition modeling. The second part, however, is somewhat harder, and that is find a good interestingness measure for this task. So let's start with a simple one. So in this paper here, we are focused on first-order Markov chain models as model classes for our transition behavior. So I guess in a sequence mining session, most of you here will be familiar with that kind of models. So just in very short summary. So Markov chain models are probably the most popular models for modeling transitions in sequence data. They are well established and frequently used in many application areas such as modeling human mobility, web navigation, economics, meteorology, you can name them all. The basic idea of Markov chain models or first-order Markov chain models is that the process is memoryless. That means that the probability distribution to which state I will go next only depends on the state I'm currently in. And as a consequence, the model parameters for Markov chain models are given by just these probability distributions, and we can write these as a matrix. And for example, you can see here that this 0.5 means that there is a 50% chance that I go from the first state to the second state, given that I'm currently in the first state. Okay, so this is like well established. We can simply and fast compute this kind of model. So well done. The problem that is somewhat more difficult, however, is how to construct an interestingness measure. And as already mentioned, the purpose of an interestingness measure is to determine a score for each subgroup, for each candidate subgroup. And this score should somehow reflect how interesting or exceptional that transitions in this subgroup are. And if we have now such an interestingness measure given, then we can just apply like any search algorithm in order to extract the k-best subgroups from our candidate sets with respect to the score computed by this measure. Well, one problem we have is that it's called interestingness measure, and it should reflect interestingness measure, but interestingness is, of course, inherently subjective. So it's not like what we are doing here is like the only possible solution. However, there's like one hard criterion that all interestingness measures that are good should fulfill. And that is if we construct an artificial data set and we model into this in this data set some influence factors and then add a variety of random noise attributes, then our interestingness measure should be able to recover the actual signal influential attributes from this noise. Okay, so how do we do this? We construct so the first step of our interestingness measure is rather simple. So we start with just computing a transition probability matrix for the overall data set. And then for each subgroup we want to evaluate, we also compute this transition probability matrix. And then what we are doing is we are just computing a distance measure between these two matrices. And well, we can do this rather simple. We go row-wise through these matrices. Each row describes a probability distribution, and then we use just an established measure for comparing probability distributions for each row. And for that, we can use something like the Manhattan distance, Kullback-Leibler divergence, Hellinger distance, basically anything you want. One more thing we should do here is that we are additionally weighting the differences with the number of observations in the subgroup for this row. So the intuition behind this is if one subgroup has like 100 outgoing transitions from state A and only 5 outgoing transitions from state C, then the transitions outgoing from state A should be more important than the ones from state C. Okay, and what we are getting here now is some kind of distance measure that compares the transition probabilities in the subgroup with the transition probabilities of the overall data set. Sounds good, sounds intuitive. Are we already finished? Well, unfortunately not, because there's one problem, and that is that this distance is heavily influenced by the subgroup size. So you can imagine if a subgroup covers like almost the entire data set, then you cannot expect that there are huge differences in the probability distributions. Okay, so what we are therefore applying additionally is we employ some kind of a randomization approach. And by that I mean that we draw a number of stratified random samples, and each of these samples covers the same number of transitions as the respective subgroup we are evaluating. What we are now doing is for each of these random samples, we also compute the distance of the probability transition matrix for the random sample to the respective matrix of the overall data set. So for each of our random samples, we get like one value for the distance measure. And since we have computed this for a number of random samples, we can build an empirical distributions for these distances. This is what we call a distribution of false discoveries. And what we are now doing is we are comparing the actual distance from the real subgroup with the distances that we derive from this kind of distribution. And we can do this, for example, by computing a set score. And intuitively, if we have here like a distribution that looks like this blue curve here, then if we have an uninteresting subgroup, if the actual distance score could just occur randomly, and we have an interesting subgroup if the actual distance from the subgroup is an outlier for this distribution. Okay, and it turns out this actually works rather well. We have more like minor problems to solve that actually also had like made me severe headaches during development. And the first question is, so how many random samples do we need? And unfortunately, that is overall difficult to say, but it's an important question because there is some kind of a trade-off between speed and accuracy. If we have like many random samples, we can compute this measure really accurate, but the algorithm gets slow. And as I said, it's difficult to give a general answer to this, but what we can do is we can estimate the kind of error that we have given a certain amount of random samples that we've already taken. And we can compute this error, or we can estimate this error using some kind of bootstrapping procedure. The second question is, how can we check the significance of findings? And one interesting observation is that this distribution of false discovery that we are employing often is approximately normal distributed. And so what we can do is we can do some normality test. And if it turns out this is sufficiently approximately normal, then we can use the z-score directly or compute a p-value from that z-score. If this is not the case, then we have still another option, and that is we just draw more and more random samples and just compute the p-value empirically. Of course, that is computationally really expensive, and so we can only use this for validating the significance of our few findings that we have, and cannot do it for all candidates in the candidate space. Whatever we are doing, we should always keep in mind that here we are doing multiple comparison tests on the same data set, so we should apply something like a Bonferroni or Bonferroni-Horn correction. Okay, so to summarize our interestingness measure, the measure we are using quantifies how different the distance is of the parameter matrix of the subgroup and the parameter matrix of the overall data set compared with the respective distances of the stratified random samples that we draw. Okay, now given such an interestingness measure, and we know how we compute this, we can basically apply like any subgroup search algorithm that has been proposed for exceptional model mining so far. So we have a wide choice of things we can do. We can do depth first search, best first search, beam search, whatever. One thing we should note, however, is that using our interestingness measure, we are somewhat slower than the more traditional interestingness measure, and that is basically because our interestingness measure, the speed of computation for our interestingness measure also depends on the number of random samples that we draw. As an additional feature, we can also slightly adapt our approach for a slightly modified mining task, and that is that we are also able to study user-defined hypotheses over the state transitions. What do I mean by user-defined state transitions? Well, given or based on existing theory, I could just speculate, okay, I think in my data set, people are almost always moving from A to B and from B to C and from C to A. Or to make a little bit more realistic example, given a data set about urban mobility, I could speculate that people probably will move to a state which is nearby and which also contains some kind of point of interest, some attractor, such a tourist attraction, a train station, whatever. Okay, so given such an hypothesis, what can I do? So I can formalize such an hypothesis again as some assumed transition probability matrix. And given such a matrix, I can then try and find subgroups that either specifically match or specifically contradict the hypothesis I want to investigate. And technically, that is then rather simple. So I just replace the dataset transition matrix with this hypothesis matrix that I generated. And then I have that subgroups that deviate strongly from the hypothesis have a high score using our measure, and subgroups that match the hypothesis exceptionally well have a low score. Okay, how do we evaluate our approach? So we had like two different parts. The first part is about validating that our approach really works, and for that purpose we did what I already outlined before, and that is we created artificial data sets where we know what the signals are. We added a lot of noise attributes and then tried to recover by our approach to find these real signal attributes again in the presence of noise. To give you an impression how this can work, okay, we have a network of colored nodes generated. On this network we have like two different types of random walkers. The one type of walker runs purely randomly. The second type of walker is more likely to continue to a state of the same color as the last node. And then we have these random walkers running, we generate transitions out of them, and then for each transition we know the type of walker, and we also add a lot of random noise attributes. And so that is like a first goal, and the second goal could also be that we additionally state some hypothesis, and this hypothesis in that case states, okay, I think people always move on to nodes of the same color. And then we can try and find exceptional subgroups compared to the overall transition behavior, or we can find exceptional subgroups that specifically match or contradict this hypothesis. And well, the short answer is that works. So if you're looking for subgroups that deviate from the overall data set, then we find like exactly these two subgroups that are described by the different types, for either the purely random walkers or the homophile walkers. And if we are looking for subgroups that exceptionally match this homophile hypothesis, then we see that really this one subgroup is like the top subgroup. One more thing that we should note is that the results we are getting, even for weak signals, are strongly significant for the real findings, but they are non-significant for the noise attributes if and only if we apply this Bonferroni correction. So this is like one of the data sets we used. We did it for several other things. One more thing, so we additionally also applied it on practical case studies. For example, we studied some data sets from Flickr. And on Flickr, we used sequences of user locations that have been derived from uploaded pictures in Manhattan. We mapped the locations to different tracts. So we had like user transitions in Manhattan. And for each transition, we could derive different attributes, like the number of photos the user uploaded, the time of the day, the month, the weekend, and the status of the user, and that is, was he a tourist or a non-tourist. And additionally, we also had, again, a hypothesis, and that was that people try to navigate to a state which is nearby and contains also a point of interest. What we get here as a result, I think, is somewhat interesting. So, for example, what subgroups are matching this proximate POIA hypothesis that people move to a nearby place with an interesting point? Well, these are users with many photos, which, if you think about it, makes sense. But what is even more intuitive is that it's about tourists. So really, tourists follow this hypothesis that they move to the next interesting location. And there are also specific times of the day where this happens. And that is roughly around from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. If you look at subgroups that contradict this hypothesis, then these are the transition at night times when probably tourist attractions are closed. Okay, so let me summarize. So in this paper, we presented a new approach for mining subgroups with exceptional transition behavior. And for this purpose, we applied exceptional model mining with a new model class, and that is first-order Markov chain models. A big part of the paper is deriving an interestingness measure that is suitable for this task. And by slightly modified approaches, we can also investigate user-defined hypotheses about how the transition behavior could look like. And we evaluated our approach with synthetic data and demonstrated the usage in real-world scenarios. Thank you.
Hello, thanks for the talk. One question, in your approach, you basically already have to have a hypothesis of what are these interesting subgroups. Have you thought about an extension where we can actually identify those subgroups using the algorithm?
Yeah, so I think there is a reason why we focus on those subgroups for which we already know the features. And that is that I relatively strongly believe is that these are really the features we can interpret. So the whole point of the approach is that we get subgroups where we directly know what kind of transitions are described. If we now try and derive some features automatically, then probably we get better fitting subgroups. So that might be good if we use the results then as an input for another algorithm, but the interpretability gets, for a good part, lost. Yeah.
Very nice work. I was wondering whether you could comment about the big O notation complexity of the algorithm.
Yeah, so in general, so the problem that you generally have for this kind of exceptional model mining work is always that your search space is exponential in the number of features you allow if you have like all conjunctions in your subspace. So what you're usually doing is you're only interested in like the shallow levels, like conjunctions of 2, 3, 4 different descriptions. So this and that and that and that. Usually you break off there. So in addition, of course, if you compare that to classical subgroup discovery algorithms, we are here really by this factor of number of drawn random samples slower. But what is probably more concerning is that so far we are not able to prune the search space using this interestingness measure, apart from. So we are slower, but I think if you're focusing on these more shallow things, then you're fine. And again, if you look at interpretability, the probably more interesting subgroups are like these shorter descriptive subgroups.
One question I have with respect to the input, data model for Markov chain to work. So, if I understand correct, basically the input data set is like you have data points for each trajectory. Is that correct? Like, for example, in the graph, every trajectory of like a walk, whether it's random or
We have a data point for each transition in a sequence. So it's not about one data point for each sequence, but one transition in one sequence.
But you don't have the whole path together as one. Like, do you have a notion of a transaction ID where this person went from here to here to here, or?
Not directly. So the Markov chain model is really based only on the transitions, regardless on if they are all in one long sequence or if there are very many short sequences.
Okay. Yeah.
But of course, if you know that it's a long sequence, then you can build descriptive features and then say, okay, transitions that are in long sequences behave differently than transitions in short sequences.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
So Florian, I had one last question. So you mentioned about this multiple hypothesis testing problem, and you said that you're going to do Bonferroni correction. But how do you know your hypothesis space size? Because effectively it can be infinite. You can come up with so many different subgroups, right?
Yeah, but there's only a limited number of hypotheses that I actually test. And these are like all subgroups that are in the candidate set that I'm considering. So if I only consider hypotheses for these features until a certain depth, then I only have to correct for them.
So conditioned on the features that you know all the entire hypothesis space of subgraphs.
I know the hypothesis.
The size.
I know, or I can estimate the number of hypotheses that I will test for.
Okay, all right. Okay, let's take the speaker again.